encounter are the clear reflections of the darkest parts of our mind, and somehow even darker than that. The worst of it is the fact that you can make an argument that real-life serial killers and criminals are even worse than the villains in Outlast. They're not trying to be the best, but the villains in Outlast are real and visceral. There's no meaning to them, they're simply a byproduct of pure evil experiments from the Murkoff Corporation, and they only view them as subjects. One of them just so happens to be an ex-employee. In Outlast 1, you're being chased by a group of violent inmates, which is a normal thing. You come across an intercom with a surprisingly friendly voice. He's telling you to hop inside the dumbwaiter to escape. Without any other option, we hop inside, and we do so just in time. But what awaits us at the end is someone much, much worse.
You made the right choice here, buddy.
Meet Dr. Richard Traeger, a former Murkoff executive. Compared to most other villains in the series, Dr. Traeger has a friendly, almost casual disposition, but it's married with a psychopathic nature. One moment he's cracking jokes like we're old friends, the next he's chopping your fingers off. At one point he even teases us with the exit, and like that's just rude, man. Even though he wasn't a doctor beforehand, after being subjected to horrific experiments, he seems to have an undying curiosity about biology now, taking up the role of a surgeon, tying up the other inmates and performing surgeries on them. We can even record Dr. Traeger killing one of the variants right in front of our eyes. According to documentation, Richard Traeger has performed countless operations in the name of science and profit. But I love Dr. Traeger's character because it's such a subversion of expectations. Normally, a villain is overly edgy or dark and mysterious. They have a personality that screams, "I'm the bad guy." Traeger, obviously his appearance is pretty intense, but his demeanor is that of a funny side character. His quote-unquote operating room is a blood-soaked bathroom. He washes his hands and mimics medical hygiene, a detail that is far more unsettling than a monster that simply growls. Yeah, I wish he would mimic putting on clothes, though. I was not a fan of seeing the curtains to the brown snake dispenser. Now, unlike the other inmates, he retains a decent portion of cognitive function. He sorta treats the player like a consumer being turned into the means of production. He doesn't just act insane, he follows through with it too. Again, slicing off some of our fingers, slapping us awake to feel the whole process. He becomes a stalker enemy in the later half of the game, and the main section he's in is absolutely horrific. You weave through multiple wards of patients strapped to their beds, or just straight up dead, but the ones that are alive will scream when you get too close, which obviously grabs Traeger's attention. Understand, Outlast villains are not trying to be scary or horrifying, they just are. The main reason as to why I find humans more terrifying in horror games than any creature is because I love creature and monster design. I'm an in-progress concept artist. I love this kind of stuff. Even Pyramid Head, which is mostly human, but has that psychological theme of guilt tied to the appearance. I think it's really cool rather than scary. Enemies in Bloodborne are certainly horrifying. The blood lickers are, yeah, but I always have a sense of admiration for their biology and creature designs, so the edge kinda wears off. In Outlast, no, there's nothing there. If you're like me, who is recently addicted to police body cam footage watching criminals get caught, you never think, what's the theme here? What symbolism are they trying to tell us? No, they're just bad people. Now, Dr. Traeger is just one example of this from the entire Outlast series. I wanted to talk about him first because I think he's quite unique with his lighthearted personality mixed with the improper medical practices, if I could even call it that. Now, if you've been on this channel before, you know that I love religious imagery and cults in video games. So of course, I have to mention Papa Noth from Outlast 2 and his congregation. In Dear Diary of Jane, there is a lot to talk about. In Outlast 2, Sullivan Noth is the leader of a cult known as the Testament of the New Ezekiel. They believe... What do they believe? Ah yes, the Antichrist will be born among their flock. So they are an active, murderous cult to prevent the birth of someone who will end their paradise inside Temple Gate. However, some of his followers want the Antichrist to be born, so they defected from the main cult and went to live in the mountains, dubbed simply as the Heretics. Religion is such a powerful tool in horror because it perverts what many consider to be divine or holy. Outlast 2 weaponizes religious extremism, showing how faith can become distorted until cruelty itself is seen as sacred. Personally, that's what I find to be the most disturbing, because they truly believe what they're doing is righteous. Even if you aren't religious, some of the things this cult has done and what they believe is downright evil. Of course, they murder anyone who stumbles upon their chapel grounds, but since they believe the Antichrist will be born soon, they pretty much murder any and all children, which is kinda hypocritical because women inside the cult are treated as breeding vessels basically. Birth and pregnancy is viewed as pure, yet they fear something that is the result of exactly that. Noth has historically convinced multiple of his followers to commit mass ending yourself rituals, to put it lightly, which is why we see so many people throughout Temple Gate burned at the stake, buried alive, or hanged. That's why at the end of the game, when the quote-unquote Antichrist is born, Noth convinces the rest of his followers to just end themselves in the midst of their town. It's a gruesome sight to behold. Also, public torture is common. We even witnessed Noth himself torture a helpless man and his wife. Anyone who would even show an inkling of rebellion against Noth would be met with death by Noth's Eye, otherwise known as Marta, his infamous executioner inside the cult. She's pretty spooky, but compared to Noth and some other villains I'll talk about later, she is nothing in comparison. Something that I didn't notice until replaying this game is that there is a loss of identity inside this cult. You are a part of something greater. You have no name, no power, no purpose other than to serve Papa Noth and nobody else. They are trained to believe that Noth is God's prophet with constant preaching, echoing throughout Temple Gate. Mass hysteria rules here. Everyone is insane and everyone has full faith in the gospel of Noth. A gospel that claims that Noth can sleep with any and all women and encourages incest. Yeah. I mean, I could continue. The amount of terrible things this cult has done is innumerable. The reason why I focused on the cult so much is, 1, I've always wanted to talk about them, and 2, it is a clear reflection of who Sullivan Noth is and what he believes. But it somehow gets even worse, because there are 2 different factions that have separated themselves from the main cult. One of them is known as the Scald, a group of cult members who are heavily diseased due to a sickness of the soul. At least, that's what Noth says. In actuality, they are afflicted with syphilis, gonorrhea, and many other STDs. Look, it takes a lot for me to be disturbed by things in video games. I have pretty callous skin. But when I figured out that the Scald are what they actually are, I was appalled. There is no myth to hide behind here, no symbolism, just decay. The Scald are almost primal, living inside terribly built shelters and tents, walking around aimlessly from their pain and suffering. They have been discarded without hope to be accepted again. Papa Noth ironically sends out some of his followers to receive medication for his own STDs, but leaves the Scald to suffer and die. It's a perfect mirror of how humanity discards those who are deemed unworthy. They don't have much lore to them besides that, but you don't really need that, they're just sick people. However, the Heretics are a completely different story, and they're the other faction. Their leader is named Val. She was once a highly appointed deacon under Noth, but experienced violent sexual dreams that caused such a disturbance in her that she fled into the mountains, digging tunnels to eventually find other followers with similar dreams. One of her notes states, "I woke up this morning thinking I was wetted with the blood of a child's slit throat." I'm gonna be an English teacher for a second, let's just pause there. What? But it was wetness of my own making. I feel increasingly this is a message, but nothing holy. I'm not gonna lie, even reading that was enough to make my chest and stomach drop. They're not really a religious cult, but are loyal to chaos and anarchy. They want the Antichrist to be born, to bring about death and chaos. Violence and lust are closely linked. At one point, Val even makes advances towards our character Blake.
God doesn't love you, not like I do.
The Heretics themselves are animalistic at this point, sometimes running on all fours or crawling at best. They don't scream or shout, they make animalistic grunts as they chase us throughout the tunnels. They cover themselves in blood, sticks, and mud, and you guessed it, they're also naked. Kinda reminds me of Darkwood a little bit, specifically the Doctor, with the sticks and mud on the face. Another fantastic horror game, by the way. Here's what I've gathered from Sullivan Noth and his cult. Outlast is not afraid to be real in its gore and in its violence. I did not realize clothing also created such a sense of safety and normalcy. It strips characters of humanity, privacy, and dignity. A lot of inmates in Outlast barely feel like people anymore. They look raw, exposed, almost unfinished. It creates this sense, this feeling that civilization has completely collapsed. Here's the thing, clothing usually symbolizes identity, order, or social order, and Outlast removes that layer entirely. Everyone feels reduced to instinct, madness, and flesh. That's why I was so disturbed by the naked twin